Welcome to the podcast of Rogue Valley Christian Church, located in Medford, Oregon. We strive to be a people who gather together to connect the unconnected to Jesus, grow together in full devotion to God, and serve the world with Him.
You can grab a seat if you like, and as you do, if you can grab a Bible, maybe the one you brought, maybe the one on your smartphone or your tablet, maybe the one underneath the seat in front of you. If you can grab your Bible and turn it to the book of Joshua chapter 6, you can find verse 21, which is where we will start this morning. Joshua chapter 6, verse 21 says this: "Then they devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, with the edge of the sword." And if you were here last week, then you recall that at this point, as we came across that verse last week near the last third of the sermon, I guess, we mentioned that this week we were going to take a closer look at the judgment or the wrath of God. Just in mentioning the term judgment or wrath of God, how many of you would be willing to say, I'm going to go ahead and pass today, and I'm going to go ahead and go on down to Roosters, grab me a cinnamon roll. I'll live stream while I'm down there. I recognize that the concept, and it's not just me, all of us recognize that the concept of God's wrath or God's judgment or both can be uncomfortable. Would you agree? It's very uncomfortable, especially when you consider kind of the context of our culture these days. I don't necessarily know what things were like, 50 years ago, but I'm pretty aware of what things have been like since then moving forward. And specifically in the context of our culture these days, any idea or thought of some sort of deity judging all of humanity, our culture claims is actually unbelievable. I will tell you that we live at a time where the greater part of our global culture, the greater part, not the pockets that we see on news, but the greater part of our global culture would rather have nothing to do with some sort of divine judgment. What's interesting about that, though, is though there's this move towards divine judgment being unbelievable, that is old-fashioned, we still, as a greater culture, hold out for human judgment, right? I say that from this perspective, meaning you wrong me, then it's my right to wrong you back. Yeah? You cut me off in traffic, I am well within my rights to fly by you and tell you you're number one. So here's the frustrating thing about God's judgment and God's wrath is this: our culture declares that it's unbelievable, and we want to believe that, but we know inside that's not actually the way it works, is it? Furthermore, if we consider it from a Christian perspective, and that is what we will be doing this morning, I really don't have a whole lot of time to be going into what everybody else may believe. But from a Christian perspective, we can see that our culture looks at it this way and wants us to believe that it's unbelievable, so therefore it becomes a little more uncomfortable, right? The community, not just our culture globally, but the community even locally, if you have conversations and if you watch things and if you look at the socials, if you will, for those of you who don't know, that means social media. You're welcome. I gave you a hip new way of saying it. But if you pay attention to certain things today, you'll recognize that it like judgment or any kind of wrath or any kind of opinion other than the one you maintain, simply put, it's very close to tribalism. It's just unfair, right? You don't understand, you can't see, and you don't, so who gives you and what gives you the right? You haven't walked a mile in my shoes, so on and so forth. So it's uncomfortable because, on a big picture, people are saying it's unbelievable. On a smaller scope, everybody says it's unfair, and so we kind of swirl around these verses. I don't know about you, but that verse, Judges chapter 6, verse 21, should make us uncomfortable. uncomfortable, even as believers. It should be uncomfortable that God's wrath was poured out on a city, meaning people, in a specific way, that people's lives were ended, and that should make us uncomfortable, but for the right reasons, not the wrong ones. Furthermore, it's uncomfortable because if you're like me, internally, even my own self-conscience, my own awareness of me, believes that it's unreasonable because, who am I and who am I to say? Does that make sense? Like when you come in that, have you ever been like watch something that is quote-unquote wrong or something that is quote-unquote not best, and you've wanted to judge it discerningly? In other words, point out that that's not the best way of going about things. But internally and mentally, you get this argument going that somehow ends up in this place of, well, who am I? Because I screw up in these areas, therefore I'm not going to say anything about that one. Does that make sense? So our consciences make it unreasonable on that end of the scale, or on this other side of the scale where it doesn't matter who I am, that's not right, and we just roll over people. The context or the concept in the conversation about God's judgment is uncomfortable, and I'm suggesting that it should be. I'm suggesting that it is okay for us to be affected by everything that's going on. We shouldn't be led by it, but it would be silly to think that our culture and our community and even our own conscience doesn't complicate the issue. It does, and that's all right. It is okay, even for Christians, for it to be a little uncomfortable. In fact, I'm suggesting that it should be. Here's why it should be, because as we talk about God's judgment, we can never, even though it's uncomfortable, we can never forget that ultimately, at the end of the day, it is biblical. Does that make sense? It's biblical. If you want, this will be a fun verse. Turn to Romans chapter 1. And if you're familiar with Romans chapter 1, you'll know that it's not going to be a fun verse. Romans chapter 1, verse 18 says this, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." It's biblical. Romans chapter 1, verse 18, "For the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven." Not from here. It's God's judgment. It's coming from a place other than here. Against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. I'm suggesting to you that it's important, even though it's uncomfortable, it's important that our tendency, to realize that our tendency as it relates to our culture, our community, and even our own minds is to kind of suppress the truth because it's uncomfortable. But instead, I'm suggesting we should embrace the truth because it's biblical. Because it's biblical. Paul will go on to say in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 through 23, and I would encourage you to, I'll just do it, never mind. It's good to read the Bible together, even the uncomfortable parts. Is that okay? Romans chapter 1, verse 19, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." What Paul communicates biblically as it relates to the wrath of God is that it is something that is necessary. Why? Because I will suggest to you, though he says "for they," I suggest to you, for me, as I was reading through this, I realized this: I tend to trade the light of his love for the darkness of my own heart. Here's what I mean by that. I recognize his divine attributes. I see his eternal power. I sense the reality and the greatness of God all around me. And I'm talking about even before I ever took a Bible school class. You with me? Even before I ever understood a Bible word I had read, deep down inside, I'm not cradling a baby, just deep down inside, my innards, my being, everything that was me somehow recognize there might be a God above all of this, and if there is, I might be in trouble. Because I recognize personally, not just everybody else out there. It's easy to take Romans chapter 1 and use it against all the evil people in the world. Does that make sense? But instead, I read it and I recognize, wait a minute. Without the grace of God and without the reality of Jesus in my life, I do that. I tend to trade, if you will, to exchange, if you will, the light of God's love that is undeniable according to His Word for some dark thought in my own mind, like I know better, I do better, I can think better, I can know. Does that make sense? Just so you know, that error is simply put, me believing that I'm better than God, which is in a sense saying, I'm godlike. Does that make sense? Nobody's amening that. Nobody's excited about that. Why? Because you recognize if you do, you might get struck down by lightning. But we all struggle with that, don't. Did somebody say amen about people getting struck by lightning? Bob's old school. But I think there is an old school reality to what we're talking about, that, wait a minute, I tend to do that. Furthermore, look at Romans chapter 1, verses 24 through 32. Paul goes on, he says, therefore, in light of what I tend to do, therefore God gave them up to the lust of their hearts, to impurity, to dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Paul goes on to say, for this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and their men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. He continues on, by the way. He continues on beyond the scope of what he has just said. He continues on and he said, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are all full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips. Let me say it again. They are gossips. Maybe one more time. Gossips. Is that enough? They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil. Check this one out. Disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they do not only do them, but they give approval to those who practice them. Well, have a good day, guys. The point is this: the judgment, the wrath of God is actually biblical, and there's a reason why. Because I tend to trade the light of His love for the darkness of my own mind. I also tend to trade His perfect plans for my own imperfect passions. Here's the thing about the list that Paul used, by the way. Paul is famous for using ad hoc lists. He just starts throwing things out there and what comes to his mind as it relates to the bad things, and he throws it out there. Know this, it's not exhaustive, it's ad hoc. He's throwing things in there. We tend to look at it as if it's exhaustive by looking at it and going, well, I didn't do that. How many of you don't have to raise your hand, but I wonder, some of you are already admitting it by the smile that's already on your face because you're an intuitive listener and you know where I'm going, which is where I'm going is this. How many of you were keeping track as the list was being read and go, I'm okay, I'm good, I don't do that. Let me burst your self-righteous bubble for a minute. As it relates to these lists, the important thing is not to keep track so that we can feel like we're okay. The important thing is to realize we're not okay. Somebody's got to step in and do something. And that's the point of God's judgment, if you will. That's the point of God's judgment. It's biblical, and there's a reason it is so. But here's the other thing. Because the judgment of God is not only biblical, but from God, just so you know, it's also holy. Meaning, infallible, meaning it's blameless, guiltless, perfect, without error, mistake-free. It is holy. Now, just so you know, when we go back to verses like Joshua chapter 6, verse 21, that talks about God devoting an entire people group and their animals to destruction, there are two schools of thought on that. There's the one school of thought that says over here, well, them dirty sinners deserved it. And there would be truth in that. Remember last week I made a point that Jericho existed as at least a settlement, as a full-blown city for some time, maybe even 5,000 years at this point. It existed as a settlement. It existed as a people, just so you know, my belief is this. It existed as a people who were more like what Romans chapter 1 describes than what we might think. And we don't like to look at people that way. We don't like to look at people that have like little kitty cats and sweet little babies and kids. We don't want to look at the reality of sin like that. But we have to understand the judgment of God is holy, but it should cause us to be uncomfortable. It shouldn't cause us to be arrogant and haughty and go point at everybody who's ever done anything wrong, forget about our own issues, and say, they all just deserved it. That's wrong. Like the holiness of God requires some sort of response that's better than that, right? It's not just a tit for tat. It's not just they did that, so they get what they deserve. Like the holiness of God, just so you know, as it relates to sin, should break our hearts, shouldn't it? Like we should read Romans chapter 1 and stop pointing fingers at everybody all around us and instead get on our knees. Why? Because our hearts are broken, that people are suffering under those kinds of struggles and sins. That should break our heart. On the other hand, we can't go over here and go, well, that's just too much. I don't like it. I don't want anything to do with it, so I'm going to imagine it all away. Which seems to be the prevailing thought for a lot of people. We're going to imagine the judgment or the wrath or the wisdom or the holiness of God away. Just so you know, it is my opinion that if you do away with God's judgment, then you do away with God's holiness. And if you do away with God's holiness, you're actually doing away with God. Because if God is not holy, therefore perfect, without error, infallible, if he's not that, then he's not God. And if there is no God, what are we doing? Does that make sense? Now please, follow me along, don't leave. If there is no God, I would suggest on a practical level, we all have better, more enjoyable things to be doing on a Sunday morning at 9:40. But there is a God, and he is holy. And at least with us, we've decided there's no better thing to be doing with our time than to come and say, oh God, you are awesome. See, the judgment of God is infallible. It's infallible spiritually. It's without error spiritually. Whoa. That was a lot. That's why no one sits in the front row. Thank you. I really don't blame you. But it's infallible on a spiritual level, meaning this: his judgment, Joshua chapter 6, verse 21, whether we get it or not, the judgment was not skewed by sin. It was not, is not, will never be skewed by sin. Does that make sense? Our judgments aren't they? Have you ever looked out upon a circumstance or multiple circumstances? Have you ever looked out at life and you've thought, well, this is the way it is, and so I'm going to act, and then you act and you realize, oh, it wasn't that way. I'm sorry. Have you ever done that? Raise your hand. Okay, just so you know, God has never done that. See? He's other than human, like he's not us. So his judgment, his perspective, his even, like the word or not, penalties on sin are without error. They have not been skewed by sin spiritually. that's really good, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. We're going somewhere. Do you guys trust me? Furthermore, his judgments are without error philosophically. I don't know about you, but I think sometimes, like there are times upstairs in my office with big, thick books on the coffee table that I think, man, maybe I missed my calling. Maybe I should have just had like an old school tobacco pipe and a book and other philosophers I could talk with and reason with. Because honestly, me reasoning with myself, and I do that, by the way, sitting at my desk studying through these things, I philosophize with myself. I say things out loud. For instance, if we do away with God's judgment, then we have to do away with God's holiness. And if we do away with God's holiness, we've taken somebody divine and made him human. Okay, so what you're saying, Darrin, and this is the conversation, what you're saying is then he's no longer God. Like, I want to be like a closet philosopher. I want to exercise my brain in the ideals of the world and be able to explain and justify and work through all kinds of things. I have a high school education, just so you know. I don't think I'm getting very far with philosophy, but if we think this through, then we have to understand that philosophically, his judgments have not only not been skewed by sin, but they've also not been skewed, you're going to like this, by any kind of human that is finite fancy. Any kind of ideal or idealism that man can think up, they have not skewed the judgments of God. And it's really good philosophically. Why? Because philosophy, just so you know, even if we're talking about biblical philosophy, how many of you guys remember the book of Colossians? In the book of Colossians, one of the errors that Paul was writing against was a form of philosophy that taught that God wasn't actually God because if Jesus came to the earth and hung out with humans, then he accepted the material world, and we know, according to our own fanciful thinking, that God can't have anything the immaterial can't have anything to do with the material, and therefore, God, Jesus, he wasn't really God. He was just a lower emanation of God, and therefore, this is the way it works. Do you guys understand how fancy that is? Like, it's like, exactly, like we're like, okay, that's a lot of complicated speculation. Just so you know, in our day and age, it's called philosophy. You can get doctorates in it. But that's what happens. Like, we do that, and what Paul was saying in Colossians, and what we have to understand now, is that his judgments, like, he's not bound by human desire to try to understand things, so we put think tanks together to try to philosophize it all to a make sensible moment. Like, that doesn't exist, right? Instead, we have to understand he's above philosophy. But if we want to speak philosophically, then his judgment is perfect and without mistakes. Why? Because he is holy. Why? Because he is God. It makes sense, even intellectually, philosophically. If God turns a blind eye to sin, then he is no longer holy. And if he is not holy, then he is not God. Does that make sense? That statement's important because culturally, even within our community, we live in a world where we would prefer that our divine, whatever that we worship, turn a blind eye to sin. Here's the problem. There's a couple of them. But the first of which is this: if God turns a blind eye to sin, then he's no longer God. And why did we sing? Does that make sense? Well, we sang and we're studying because we believe something. Remember the book of Job? Do you guys remember Job? I've talked to a number of people as of late who say, oh, my favorite book of the Bible. It's Bethany, you're the only one. Bethany loves the book of Job. So do I, actually. As we start, sorry, sweetie, I love you. As we work through this, by the way, I think you would love it too, because here's what happens. We know what happens in the book of Job. There's this tragedy. It wasn't God's fault, by the way. It was an attack from the enemy. And it happens, and Job loses everything. So what happens? Chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter of humans, i.e. the friends of Job, coming and explaining why. Does that make sense? This is why it happened, and this is why it happened, and this is why it happened. All the while, Job just kept getting kicked while he was down. Did you ever get that sense while you read it? Like, come on. I think, just so you know, this is my own commentary on the friends in the book of Job. Just this is a freebie. The commentary, my own personal commentary on the friends of the book of Job is they were at their best when they showed up and said nothing. When they opened their mouth, things got irritating. You ever read the book of Job and just get, oh gosh, what are they saying? Well, somebody's got to say something, right? Well, here's the interesting thing. In the book of Job, starting around chapter 38, God actually begins to say stuff. He literally, and I'll paraphrase the whole thing for you, he literally says this: who do you think you all are? Did you create everything out of nothing? Can you tell when a goat's gonna give birth? It's biblical, he said it, right? Can you tame the raging sea? Who do you think you are? You know what the response of Job was? The response of Job in chapter 42 is Job goes, oh God, you're right, I'm not God. He falls down on his face and he repents in sackcloth and ashes, humbly says, you're holy, I'm not. Who did I think I am for whining, moaning, or complaining, or listening to these friends who didn't know what was going on? You see, that's the reality with God's judgment. On a human level, we always try to make it make sense on our level and say, well, this is why this happened. And God says, who do you think you are? I know what I am doing. Does that make sense? I recognize at this point that here's the interesting thing. We have to maintain an unwavering faith, even in the face of unfathomable questions when it relates to the judgment of God. Because just so you know, if we go back, here you go, there's going to be some good Bible college instruction. If we go back to Joshua chapter 6, and we read in verse 21 that an entire people group was devoted to destruction, including young. Not just old people, but young people, right? If we read that, we have to maintain some sort of faith. I know about Canaanite religion, just so you know. I know about what the Jericho people did. I know about the way that they worship Baal, just so you know. If you want to read about that historically, you can. And the people of Jericho who were Canaanite, and their religious system was really, really messed up. To the point that they would, just so you know, they would burn their own babies as a sacrifice to Molech. Okay? But here's my deal. Like, well, wait a minute. Baby didn't have anything to do with that. What is God thinking? My answer to you, according to 20 years of Bible college, my answer to you is, I don't know. As a finite human being, we have to give ourselves permission to say, I don't know, but I won't stop trusting God. See, I don't know, but I'm going to maintain an unwavering faith even in the face of an unimaginable question. Does that make sense? I will say this just on an apologetic note, just so you know, apologetics, the defending of our faith to outsiders who maybe don't believe. Sometimes I don't know is a really good answer. Do you know what I mean? We do people a disservice when we dilute God into a completely knowable, reasonable reality. And then they come to church and they hear Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, you have to have faith. And faith is, according to his word, the substance of things hoped for, even the things not seen, the reality of holding on to God even when we don't know. And I suggest to you the uncomfortable, biblical yet infallible judgment of God requires faith. Why? Because it's true and it's without error even practically, meaning this, his judgments are not messed up by my own personal problems. My own personal problems with trying to understand it. or even my own personal problems that don't want me to understand it. Do you guys know the difference? Do you see what I'm talking about? My own personal problems that don't understand it. Like, I don't understand exactly what he's doing every single moment, right? We're going to continue to read in the book of Joshua about wars and battles and people dying and land being traded and changed and all of that. And sometimes it's hard to remember the big picture that, wait a minute, God is righting all wrongs and he's bringing about the Savior. It's hard to remember that sometimes in the middle of maybe some of the fights and the wars and the confusions. So sometimes my own personal problems mean this: I don't understand. But it doesn't make his judgment any less perfect. On the other hand, over here, I don't want to understand. Why? Because if I understand, then I have to put that same judgment on me. Does that make sense? Part of why I don't want to understand is because in a sneaky way, I know that on the outside I might not be as bad as I could be, but on the inside, without Jesus, I'm as bad off as everybody else. Right? And so sometimes I don't want to understand it. Why? Well, because I don't want the judgment to come upon me. Well, here's where we have to remember. We have to remember that the judgment of God is ultimately a hopeful thing. It's ultimately hopeful. Let me give you 2 reasons. Number 1, it's hopeful because he takes sin seriously. Are you with me? The wrath of God is hopeful because it indicates that God takes sin seriously. And I don't think it takes any imagination or any kind of disagreement to realize that he most likely takes sin more seriously than we do. Are you with me? And there's hope in the reality that he takes sin seriously. Let me explain why. Because if he did not, then anything goes. Now, at 20, do you guys remember 20? John, nope. Do you want to remember 20? Oh, you do? Okay. Well, John, as a 20-year-old man, because I can still remember, some 30 years ago, as a 20-year-old, I remember, man, I would have loved for anything to go. Because if anything goes, I don't have to worry about anybody else, and I can just do whatever I want. Does that make sense? But here's what happens to 20-year-olds. They don't stay 20. Usually they make 25, and sometimes they make 30, 35, 40, 45, 50. And what happens then is a 50-year-old will look back at 20-year-old and realize, wait a minute, though I may have wanted to do everything I wanted, I see everything you want to do dance, right? Sometimes we forget that the ripples of us doing everything we wanted actually has far-reaching effects that can actually hurt people. And you see it 50 looking back. If you're here and you're 20, just trust us and look forward. Right? But I realize that, wait a minute, God takes sin seriously, and I'm really glad he does. There's hope in that. Why? Because that means this: less people will get hurt. Whether we like it or not, we live in a world that doesn't want to take sin seriously, unless, of course, it's against you. But we just want anything to go and everybody to just do what they want. And why can't we all just get along? Well, the problem with that, if you look at world history, you recognize where cultures of people have been free to do whatever they want, people get hurt. Why? Well, we don't like it, but I'm going to tell you why. Why? Because the reality of Romans chapter 1 is true for every single one of us from the cradle to the grave without Jesus. Does that make sense? And on our own, we will hurt people. We need God to take sin seriously. And if he takes sin seriously, he has to deal with it seriously. And in order for him to do that, when he does that, guess what happens? Suffering begins to stop. Hurt begins to stop. Struggles begin to stop. It is the very judgment of God that is holding back all the horror that humanity could put upon itself. Did you know that? We need God to take sin seriously. Romans chapter 6, verse 23 says, "For the wages of sin is death." Now, some of you are going, but the free gift of God is eternal life. We'll get there. For the wages of sin is death. Paul says in Colossians chapter 2, and you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. God takes sin seriously. He wants the serious sin that we suffer under and struggle with to be canceled out, right? This is why we need God's judgment. God doesn't just look at everything and go, oops, you did it again. Well, let me clean that up for you. That's not judgment. The reality of God taking sin seriously, which his people would have known throughout the whole Old Testament. I was thinking about this in the shower last night. Weird place to think, but that's where I was thinking. I was thinking about the people who grew up, even these people in the Old Testament, growing up with their family members, sacrificing animals. Blood was shed day after day after day after day after day to temporarily atone for their sins. They were reminded day after day after day by the shedding of animal blood that God took sin seriously, and ultimately he was pointing to a sacrifice that would take care of it eternally. There's hope in the judgment of God, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Because not only does God take sin seriously, but he took on sin personally. He took on sin personally. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Now again, you guys are saying, well, but whoever believes will have eternal life. Yes, but before you get to the whoever believes part, you have to understand that he gave his only begotten son as the perfect sacrifice for all sin, past, present, and future, eternally. All sin, past, present, future, was judged on the shoulders of Jesus Christ. God's wrath for all of humanity's sin, past, present, future, was poured out on his son. This is where the hope comes from. Because the judgment of God declares, the wrath of God declares that we can truly be forgiven. I've talked to a number of people that have just struggled with maybe a sin from 20 years ago. Have you ever done that? I know if you're 20, you haven't, but go with me. Wrong service. There's nobody 20 here. What up? Let me see if I can get out of this. You're not nobody. You're somebody. That's philosophy. What it means is this: because God judged sin and takes sin seriously, the wrath for our sins, not his, was poured out on his son once and for all. The Bible declares that because of the grace of God, because that somebody was willing to die, because while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, the Bible declares that we can be forgiven. And without the wrath and the judgment of God, that's not a real thing. But because it is, we exist in a time of hope. That even in the midst of unfathomable or unimaginable questions, we can have unwavering faith. Why? Because the judgment of God points ultimately to the love of God in Jesus Christ. Philosophically, just so you know, by comparison, what other religious system's God would take sin upon themselves? It's what separates Yahweh. It's what separates Jesus from all other beliefs. He took it upon himself on our behalf.